Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to this week's episode of the Digital Law News, produced by Anson Evaluate. I'm Amelia Davies, an apprentice solicitor at Digital Law UK. I'm joined by my colleague Peter Wright, and we're just going to run through some news stories which are coming up this week. I'll pass over to Peter to introduce himself, and then we will get started.
Thanks, Amelia. My name's Peter. I'm a solicitor and I'm the Managing Director at Digital Law, and we've got some interesting bits of analysis for you this week on some topical news stories when it comes to the law and technology aspects of them. So I will pass back to Amelia to kick us off.
Thanks, Peter. So as we're all aware, the hotter weather has come in this week and everyone is jetting off on holiday. However, action fraud are back with 4,244 reports between 2021 and 2022 of holiday and travel related fraud. And this is an increase of over 120% when compared to the previous financial year. So this previous financial year will of course have been kind of COVID times where travel had been restricted. But as we are now kind of outside of the restrictions, are we going to be seeing more victims of financial fraud in relation to this? Quite possibly. So I will hand over to Peter to continue with this.
Thanks, Amelia. I mean, this is interesting. I think it's quite clear that there's probably been an increase because of the pandemic. I think it's because even though, I think there's a lot of uncertainty at the moment, sort of economically, and people aren't sure what's around the corner. I think after the last 2 years, a lot of people are thinking, you know what, I'm just going to go away. We've not been away for the last 2 years. We're going to go, and then whatever comes up on the rails after that comes up. So that's why we've had these massive queues at airports, not just in the UK, but across Europe. But in particular, it's the fact that people's habits when it comes to booking their travel has now changed. So you only have to walk down the average high street to see that all the travel agents are now all boarded up. And are no longer there. And of course, it used to be the case that if you were booking a flight, you might walk into a travel agent's. Well, certainly that's what you did 20 years ago. But certainly it's now the case that very often all your bookings are done online. But now there's the risk of, do you actually know if that flight comparison website or that airline site that you think is genuine, is it really genuine? Or is it designed to look very much like a genuine comparison site, but actually when you go to it, it's merely offering you details of flights that don't exist, but payment details that certainly do exist, so that you then end up entering your hard-earned money thinking you're buying flights, and then nothing happens afterwards. And I mean, that's a large number, 4,244 reports of holiday and travel-related fraud. That is a significant amount. That's just the number that actually then reported to action fraud. And we've talked a lot on this podcast about action fraud in the past. The fact that they are particularly good, the fact they don't really do anything. So given that over the last 18 months it's been widely publicised that you can report it to action fraud, but it'll be largely a pointless exercise, that 4,244 is just those who have bothered to do so. I think it's likely that a larger number either haven't bothered to report to action fraud or don't know that you should even report to action fraud. And then there's always those who don't want to admit that they've been ripped off and fallen for a scam, which is always probably a larger proportion as well. So I think we need to think here that that's very much, I think, the tip of the iceberg, and a lot more people are likely to have been ripped off here when it comes to anything from flights to rail travel, to booking what they think might be courtesy cars or coach trips, all that sort of thing we're talking about here when it comes to travel-related fraud. And the fact is that sometimes I think people are being brought in through they might see what they think is a promotion that's being promoted on social media, and you think, well, is it really a genuine promotion? And this comes down, I'm afraid, to the same things that we used to do if we were booking flights in person. If it's a travel agent, make sure it's a member of ABTA, the Association of British Travel Agents. Any travel agent should be registered with them, and that means that your holiday would be protected. Even in the event then of the wonderful world of cancellations and problems we've had this year, at least you know it is not a fraudulent, spurious site. Otherwise, then it's a matter of making sure it is, book directly from the airline site. Don't necessarily follow links through from comparison sites. By all means, use a comparison site to sort of compare what you think are the different flights that might be going to or from a particular area, country, and into a particular airport. But then once you think you've worked out what you want to do, forget the comparison site and then go and book it directly with BA, Jet2, Ryanair, whoever it may be that is charging you the what you think is the genuine site. And even if it is then a Ryanair or a Jet2 or EasyJet, obviously make sure, as ever, and this isn't necessarily fraud, it's just sharp business practices, that actually what you're going to pay is actually the amount that you've originally thought it would be, because suddenly you find that, I think with Ryanair, if you want to, it says your ticket is this much. Oh, would you like to sit down? That'll be a bit more. Oh, would you like us to provide, steps so you can walk off the plane? That'll be extra. It's pretty extreme. So just be mindful of that and the extras that get added on with any airline, as always. But quite frightening there that Action Fraud have had that many that many incidents reported to them.
Thanks, Peter. I think one of the main things to add here is that's so the reported loss is actually over 7 million, which creates an average loss of almost £2,000 per victim. So, I mean, when we talk about fraud, it is always varying amounts, but this is significantly higher, being it a holiday, because you are thinking, oh, I'm spending X, Y, and Z. It's okay. This is sort of normal. And where people are going to be trying to find the best deals, you do get sites cropping up. I'm a regular traveller on the train, and I know myself, I'm always trying to find the best price for my journey. But it's like you say, Peter, trying to use kind of reputable sites and checking the reviews is one of the things that I found. A lot of, I use a specific train fare comparison site. And at first I was actually fairly wary, because I thought, wow, I'm saving £20 on my ticket. That's considerable. But I then did kind of my due diligence and did some research to double check that this was in fact a reputable site. And I think that's what people need to make sure that they are doing here.
Indeed. And I think the thing here as well is just, I think that sometimes when you see what looks like a particularly good deal, if it appears on, say, a social media feed, you think, oh, that looks really good. And you think, oh, I want to get that deal while it's there. And very often, if you then follow the link, there will be inducements to say, only 3 left, or only 1 left, or this will disappear in 30 seconds. It's very often on these fraudulent sites, there'll be something to induce you, to bounce you into what you think is securing that opportunity and making a payment to secure it, without actually being able to stop and think, well, hang on, is this actually genuine? If you thought you were booking, say, directly from an airline or a particular tour operator, if that website has now changed or looks a bit different from the last time you used it, that might be the giveaway that it's not just a refresh, that it could be a fraudulent platform that you're using. And if you do sort of get induced onto one of these sites from what looks like an incredibly good deal that's come up in your social media feed, if it seems too good to be true, very often it is. But as you quite rightly said there, Amelia, the sheer volume there, we're always talking about thousands of pounds at a time here, because travel's not cheap. So it's a lucrative market for fraudsters to be operating in, because it only takes a couple of transactions and suddenly you're doing rather well.
Thanks, Peter. So moving on to our next story. This is looking at kind of Meta as the overarching company, but specifically Instagram here. So Instagram have been launching new parental controls across the platform in the UK from the 14th of June. So this includes options of setting daily time limits between 15 minutes and 2 hours, where after which a kind of black screen appears on the app saying that you reached your daily limit. Parents can also schedule break times and see any accounts that their child has reported and for what reason this was reported. They'll also be rolling out kind of parent dashboards on virtual reality headsets as well. So this initially had started in the US in March, and we are now seeing this in the UK. I think this is fairly interesting here. I'll pass over to Peter to continue.
It is. Thanks, Amelia. But I couldn't help but think with this story that as well, it's an example of Meta showing that they're doing something. Oh yes, look, we're acting to make sure that parents have control over the content that their kids see, and look, they won't end up spending hours and hours scrolling through social media. The thing is, is that what's being announced here, will that necessarily work if the child has opened up their own account without their parents' knowledge and put in fake information to be able to trick Instagram into thinking that they're an adult? And then could they then be, if they're then using a device that the adult doesn't know about, or they're using the device when the adult isn't in the room, will these, on their own account, would any of these parental controls apply? And I suspect the answer is no, they wouldn't. And really, this isn't going to the heart of the problem, which is it is rather easy for children to end up going onto these platforms, which are designed for adults, and seeing content that should be for adults and language that is supposed to be adults talking to adults, when in fact you see children in there. And we know already from those that are going on, and there's mention here about VR controls, we know already from those who've been on to Meta's VR platforms that already there are instances of children being spoken to by adults in unregulated spaces. And I couldn't help but get the impression here that this was just very nice window dressing, an attempt to show that, look, we are doing stuff after all. Look, we are taking these risks seriously, but in reality, it's not going to stop the concerning pattern of behaviours that we've seen on social media platforms in recent years, which is now leading to, for a lot of these big platforms now, a reduction in their active user numbers, which is already happening on Facebook. Instagram is flatlining to a certain extent, and it's part and parcel of the negative publicity, but also the fact that a lot of these platforms, like Instagram, like Facebook, are now all full of older adults and kids that actually themselves don't really want to go onto those platforms. They'd rather go somewhere else. So they're jumping onto TikTok and other platforms. But as I say, this struck me as being just window dressing. It's interesting, actually, when you think that Meta now has senior management. Sheryl Sandberg has now departed. You've got senior management pulled from the sphere of politics and policy making. So people that, like Nick Clegg, who used to be the UK Deputy Prime Minister, and other people who've been advisors in Washington, DC and London and other capitals around the world. And this is an excellent example of what governments do, rushing something out to say, look, we're doing something. Look, we're being proactive and we're listening and we're being responsible. But actually, when you drill into it and you think, what does this actually do? Is it actually helpful? Does it go to the heart of solving the problem? And of course it doesn't, I hate to say. So prove me wrong. But as I say, this looks really like some very pretty window dressing that's not actually going to the heart of the issue.
So Peter, you keep mentioning like the heart of the issue. Potentially here is Meta kind of preempting the online safety bill that is kind of being widely spoken about at the moment, because that online safety bill is looking at adding more protection of harmful material for children so that they can't access it. Kind of, do you think that Meta are maybe trying to get a step ahead of this in terms of kind of lobbying and trying to maybe change the kind of the spectrum of the online safety bill?
Oh, without doubt, Amelia, I think you're quite right. It's a matter of trying to show that, look, we are being proactive, we are doing things. Even before you've introduced things like your online safety bill, it's saying to the UK government, it's saying, look, we're putting in these great controls, you don't need to worry about us. And I think you also have to look at it in the context of the fact that there's, as well as that, you've got things like the Digital Services Act coming in at a European level. So across the European Union, that will be looking at content and content moderation and content control. So this is turning around and empowering parents and sort of fits into that spirit. You've also got legislation and moves in the US Congress to potentially, there's certainly movements around the possibility of having a federal data privacy law. You've already got state level data privacy laws. You've then got increasing moves to look at competition and market forces within the tech sector that could make a significant impact in the US. So to turn around and be sort of trying to make these measures makes it easier then when these big tech companies like Meta sit down as lobbyists with advisors, ministers, secretaries of state to be able to say, look, here is a demonstrable, achievable thing that we've done here that shows our intent and shows that we are being responsible in the market. And probably they can then point to a whole timeline of other measures that they're looking to introduce as well, of which this is only one. So it can be part of a narrative that you may wish to then portray. But as I say, it doesn't really go to the heart of, does it actually either stop children getting potentially being able to have access to these spaces without the knowledge of their parents? What does it do then? As well as the actual moderation once people are on there. These controls here, okay, they give power to the parents, but what about if you do have people who are underage, and if they do have it during their between 50 minutes and 2 hours screen time, what happens to the content that they might see on there? What if they see content around self-harm? What if they see content around child abuse? What if they see content that might encourage people with eating disorders to harm themselves? All these sorts of things that we've seen are a big problem on these platforms. This doesn't do anything to address that at all, but it sounds very impressive because you're giving parents the power.
Thanks, Peter. It'll be interesting to see where this goes in the future, and no doubt we will be going back to Meta and the online safety bill later in another podcast. Moving on to our next story. This is looking at the new cybersecurity hub that has been opened at Dundee in the university there. This is the first of its kind in Scotland, and it covers 4 floors, which will be looked at by businesses, academics and students. And it's quite interesting this has come about because you mentioned not getting to the heart of the problem in that last story there, but we, in a few podcasts ago, we had been speaking about the National Cyber Strategy, and kind of the underpin of this strategy was making sure that cybersecurity and tech was being addressed. And we're seeing that a new cybersecurity research centre has been opened. So are we seeing kind of maybe the National Cybersecurity Strategy put into practice there, Peter?
To a certain extent, yes. I think that it's important that when we have these major strategies announced, that you can see things happening, and things not just happening in London and the South East. So it's good that something's happening here in Scotland. It's good that it's creating jobs. It's good that it's potentially then meaning that things like the NHS the NHS in Scotland is being protected in particular, bearing in mind we have separate NHS Wales, NHS Scotland, NHS England. Given the huge amounts of resources, huge amounts of incredibly sensitive data that the NHS in all of the home nations handles, we want to make sure that is being looked after to a good standard. And we know after the WannaCry attack in 2017 that is not always the case. So in this instance, good to see that something is happening here. Good that there's been partnership between the UK and the Scottish Government to fund this and to make sure that this university is then benefiting from this cyber quarter centre. And hopefully we'll see more of this. Hopefully we'll see similar initiatives in Wales and universities around the UK. Again, not just, for example, Russell Group universities, which have plenty of funding, but let's make sure this is going to some of those areas in different parts of the country, and particularly, say, in the West Country or in the north of England, where those educational institutions will really benefit from partnerships of this type. And let's not forget that then when you've got those universities producing these highly skilled individuals of which there is a massive need by different employers at the moment, highly skilled cybersecurity professionals are in short supply. This is then meaning that you've hopefully got greater opportunity in the regions to sort of be able to level up opportunity to a certain extent, that wonderful phrase the government likes to use, as well as actually sort of, I mean, by talking living up as a new problem, you can look at some of the socio-economic problems between the sort of north-south divide that it's got progressively worse and worse over the last 40 odd years. So therefore, if you can see an initiative like this, hopefully it does make a difference and does actually mean that people are able to get these skills without having to necessarily leave and say go to London and actually able to still get those skills, get into those good, highly skilled jobs, well-paying jobs, and not necessarily fracture communities with people having sort of joining a flight to other parts of the country in search of that sort of on your bike to go and find the work in other parts of the country, which leaves some communities bereft. So more of initiatives like this should hopefully be a good thing.
Thanks, Peter. So moving on to our next story, and it'll come as no surprise what we'll be covering next. So this is the Amber Heard and the Johnny Depp libel case. We talked about this in great detail last week, where we essentially looked at the sum that Depp won and the sum that Heard won. However, there has been an update. Now I'll pass over to Peter to take us through this.
Thanks. So thank you, Amelia. This is really the gift that keeps on giving, the Amber Heard, Johnny Depp story. I don't think we need to go over the facts again. Suffice to say the reason why we are covering this is because it highlights the issues around libel, which apply both in the digital sphere as well as in the real world. Don't forget both this case in the court in Virginia, as well as the original Depp libel trial in the UK 12 months ago, where Amber Heard was not a party, she was a witness, but nonetheless it was because an article had been written that seemed to support Amber Heard's claims that Johnny Depp was perpetrating domestic violence. He lost in the UK, but then he won in Virginia. So this has significant implications. And then the recent developments, in short, are that having been given an award of approximately $8 million, there was an offer by Depp to then basically waive the payment of that by Amber Heard to him, basically saying, look, if you drop any potential appeal, then I will then probably drop the pursuit of you for the $8 million and we'll call it quits. Because ultimately, this was never about the money, I think, for Johnny Depp. It's been more about clearing his name. It's already clear that now that he has seemingly cleared his name, there's already talks of another Pirates of the Caribbean movie. There's other movies that may now happen. So it means that he can start earning again, which I think has always been the point here. And now that he has that judgment in his back pocket from Virginia, he can then move on and do that. So really, the $8 million from Amber Heard pales into insignificance compared to the tens of millions per movie that he would stand to earn otherwise. However, Amber Heard has also then given an interview to NBC in the United States, basically repeating the same claims that she'd just been sued for libel for in Virginia. So who knows what will happen? Will she end up being sued again? What will happen? Who knows? I think that the chances of that more amicable, I won't come after you for the $8 million if you don't appeal solution, probably now has been blown out of the water by that interview. So the chances are that this story isn't going away. So sorry for those of you who couldn't care less and don't really want to hear any more about these two Hollywood actors going at each other's throats in the way we've heard for the last couple of months. So who knows, there could yet be more in the way of dramatic court hearings, interviews and interventions on this subject. I know that sometimes it's tempting, Amelia, we go, oh, let's wait and see. And I don't think we really want to wait and see. I don't think we want to hear anything more on this subject. But, it's just when you think it's dead, it then comes back even more powerful than it was before. So, if this is the last time we cover this, I'll be very surprised.
Exactly. Moving on to our next story. This is looking at cryptocurrency, and the crypto is at its lowest value for 18 months. And experts are saying this is because of the wider global climate and kind of in the crypto world, this isn't looking good. We're looking at kind of the fact that recession it potentially could be looming. You've got inflation soaring as well as interest rates rising. And the fact that kind of cryptocurrency is unregulated mainly, this is not adding any sort of security to people are not wanting to take the risk of putting their money in cryptocurrency. And as a result, even big investors are kind of being a little bit more stringent with how they're spending their money and how they're investing. And that's, if we're looking at big investors there, what are the normal people, myself, Peter, normal people, what are we going to be doing? Probably not going to be investing in crypto. And so Binance, the largest global crypto exchange, paused withdrawals for a few hours. It was like stuck in transactions, but not everyone was believing this. And yet another crypto lender, Celsius, they had done the same, but had cited extreme market conditions rather than technical difficulties. So I'll pass over to Peter to continue with this one.
Thanks, Amelia. I read this week that the Matt Hancock, who used to be the Secretary of State for Health in the UK, but before that he was Secretary for Digital Culture, Media and Sport, and before that he was a Minister for Digital Technology. He's been evangelising about the benefits of cryptocurrency being the future this week. It's almost like the minute that finally, a politician like Matt Hancock picks it up, it truly is dead. And that seems to be what's happening here. The fact that there's been a sell-off in crypto assets over the last couple of months isn't news. I think the fact that the news is that it is continuing. I think the fact that Bitcoin is now below that psychological barrier of $30,000 that it has been north of now for a significant period of time, the fact it's now gotten less than that is starting to, I think, spook investors, because they're suddenly realizing that there is no floor in terms of how low these cryptocurrency assets could fall. The very concept of a stable coin has been blown out the water, because the idea was, if it is a stable coin and linked to an asset like, say, the US dollar, it will therefore only fall to a certain amount. Well, that's been tested to destruction, because a number of stable coins have fallen far lower than the theoretical maximum limits that being a stable coin imposed. Meanwhile, Bitcoin is not pegged to any other currency, but I think people always felt that it was the original and best. It was the one that had the highest value and has had the biggest number of examples of people making huge amounts of money from original investments that were negligible, or having just mined Bitcoin many years ago. And now we're seeing that the sudden spectre of the fact that this whole thing could come crashing down, that people could find that their cryptocurrency is absolutely worthless, is really spooking the market. That's the reason why these traders like Binance and Celsius are suddenly finding that they're struggling to process the sheer volume of transactions. And don't forget that all these transactions will be people frantically selling, very few people buying at this point. So these platforms probably weren't really designed to cope, A, with that sort of volume of transactions, and B, the fact that they're all a transaction of the same type, i.e. selling them as people try and get out what's left of their original real hard currency money, and try and dump the crypto asset. So it means that liquidity becomes a problem. So that's the reason why both Binance and Celsius and probably other exchanges will have had a problem. It says that even the Coinbase exchange has said it's laying off 18% of its workforce, blaming the crypto winter, as it calls it. And it was only a few months ago that we had, some people were saying that, some organizations and countries even were starting to take Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies as legal tender. There was talk that you'd be able to go and buy a Tesla with, or may even have been able to buy Tesla and other significant assets. You'd be able to do it with your cryptocurrency rather than having to convert that cryptocurrency into hard currency, or traditional currency. And so that promised land seemed to be quite close, and a lot of innovation was happening in that area. And people were thinking that digital currency, digital transactions were the future. The last few months have suggested that optimism may have been misplaced, and that the brave new world that these people were creating, and the idea of Web3 with blockchain, cryptocurrency, non-fungible tokens, was going to be the future digital economy. That may still be the case. It may still be the case that Web3 will be the future, but it's not going to be upon us quite as quickly as it may have seemed, certainly in 2021. Now the frightening thing will be how low will some of these assets go. It's quite scary for some people, and I know that there was one particular island, but it's a US territory, and I don't know if it was Puerto Rico or another territory, but I did read a few months ago that an awful lot of cryptocurrency investors had moved there, that the economy of that island was becoming very much centered on cryptocurrency. And then when Bitcoin started to lose value, the governor of that island announced, we've brought a load of Bitcoin while it's low so we can ride the wave as it goes back up again. And unfortunately, I thought at the time that's brave, because what if it continues to go down and you've just put your taxpayers' money into a heavily depreciating asset? And sure enough, that's exactly what's happened. The frightening thing is I don't think we've reached the bottom of the curve yet, and it could yet fall an awful lot further because of the general instability in the global economy. We've got Russia and Ukraine at each other's throats. I've read more today about China and Taiwan and the threats there, and the new Chinese aircraft carrier that's about to be launched. Add that together with supply chain problems we've got, the shortage of energy. These are all global issues that are affecting the market and have been because of the economic circumstances created by the lockdowns that we've had around the world. And don't forget that we continue to have very severe lockdowns in China and a number of other countries. And those lockdowns will continue to have an impact on global supply chains, not to mention on energy prices for the foreseeable future. So the current difficult economic conditions that we've had since the autumn of last year are only going to continue and most likely exacerbate with much higher inflation. And in the meantime, what people thought was a port in the storm, cryptocurrency, is rapidly proving not to be a safe port in the storm, and in fact is a rather dangerous one. Surprise, surprise, it wouldn't surprise me if people end up putting all their money into those things like gold and the stuff that usually has kept its value no matter what, and will probably continue to do so. But this is now a terrible wake-up call for those who'd stake the future, like Matt Hancock, who'd stake the future on being Web3 and cryptocurrency arriving within months. It now looks like it could be still a few years until that sector recovers, let alone before it becomes the dominant means of financial services transactions around the world.
Thanks, Peter. So moving on to our last story today, this is looking at the Apple iPhone lawsuit. So a consumer champion is suing Apple for $768 million over a software update in 2017 that effectively slowed down older iPhones. So Justin Gutman is seeking damages on behalf of up to 25 million iPhone owners in the UK who are affected by Apple's practices. Apple has actually admitted that a software update released in 2017 hampered the performance of devices, although it claims that the software was meant to protect the battery life of the phone. However, this was not the case. The company previously paid $113 million to settle a similar case in Arizona and $500 million to settle another one in California. And so this particular claim is actually an open-ended claim. So that means it's an opt-out claim. So people that owned maybe an iPhone 6, an iPhone 6S, 6S Plus, SE, all the way up to an iPhone X model do not need to actively join the case to seek damages. So I will pass over to Peter to continue with this.
Thanks, Amelia. I was just thinking, as you're introducing this story there, that the classic story of large tech firms producing software that's intentionally full of bugs that then needs endless costly upgrades or replacements, or becomes obsolete just as quickly as it came along. People have been saying that for 20 years, and then suddenly Apple's caught doing something like this. They have, of course, produced a statement. So they have said, we have never and would never do anything to intentionally shorten the life of any Apple product or degrade the user experience to drive customer upgrades. Really? Would you mind saying that in evidence? Because I bet they wouldn't. And they have already admitted here that, upgrades have affected performance entirely unintentionally. Oh, of course, entirely unintentionally, accidentally on purpose. This is the way that, unfortunately, a lot of the big tech firms, not just Apple, have done this. But Apple has its own ecosystem, which it very jealously controls, and it has been able to set the rules of the playground in this instance, and they're merely being found in multiple jurisdictions, being held to account for the way that playground has been ruled. So yeah, it's a significantly sized action here. It'll be interesting to see what the eventual outcome is. But it's not looking very good for Apple, as anyone who's seen the rash of headlines about this week will have noticed.
Thanks, Peter. So that was our last news story for today. A big thank you to Anson Evaluate for helping us to produce this webinar, and we'll be back next week. Just a reminder that these episodes are available on our website, our YouTube channel, and podcast channels as well, such as Spotify, Amazon Music, and Apple Music. Thank you for listening, and we hope to see you again next week.